Imagine if you had a set of clothes that made you invisible. How would you use that technology? Would you pay visits to bank vaults and jewelry stores, maybe play some pranks on loved ones, spy on your neighbors, mess with people's minds? Now imagine that technology in the hands of secret agencies, intelligence groups, or maybe corporate entities in the black world. Imagine what kind of mischief they could get into, the mind games they could play on us as they tested and perfected the technology. On the Coast website tonight, we posted a story about new breakthroughs in invisibility technology. This is not far-flung futuristic stuff. This is going on now, announced by private companies and researchers. And you have to figure, if they're talking about it in open source forums, companies, how far along are the spooks of the black world, the spies, those who operate in that nether world that we now know as the surveillance state, which is, we believe, omnipresent, right there over your shoulder, reading every email, listening to every phone call. I mean, invisibility could take that to a whole different level. Tonight, the stories of a couple of people who stumbled into this world, came face to face with the technology, and paid a price for it, thought they might be going crazy. Then they found out the startling truths that it's all too real, just how far it may have gone. It's very spooky stuff, very disturbing, as described in the book Chameleo, subtitled A Strange But True Story of Invisible Spies, Heroin Addiction, and Homeland Security by Robert Guffey. In a moment, Robert Guffey, here on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back. Robert Guffey is a lecturer in the Department of English at Cal State University, Long Beach, a graduate of the famed Clarion Writers Workshop in Seattle, author of a collection of novellas entitled Spies and Saucers. Sounds like a book we need to talk about. His first book of nonfiction, Cryptoschatology, Conspiracy Theory as Art Form, came out in 2012. The new book is Chameleo, A Strange But True Story of Invisible Spies, Heroin Addiction, and Homeland Security. Welcome to the program, Robert Guffey. Good to have you here.
Hi. Hello. I'm honored to be on.
Man, I finished the book today. It is a wild ride, and it's right there in the title, in the subtitle, True Story. It is a true story, right?
Absolutely. You know, it's funny. I've noticed in some of the book reviews, people will wonder aloud. You know, I really love the book. It moves along like a screenplay, like a thriller. Is it really true? I think people are so used to being lied to that when you label something as a true story, they assume you're doing some sort of trick or some sort of postmodern ironic experiment or something. No, it's exactly what it says it is. It's absolutely a true story.
Well, I figure what we do is in this hour, we sort of take the long, strange trip, and you tell me about this series of events that you and your friend Dion experienced for yourselves. And then in the next hour, we're going to get into this confrontation, not really a confrontation, but a sit-down you have with the guy who really let us know that is real, and the guy and where it started. So let's start with this. Let's start with Dion. I mean, because I've already got some emails from people who say, all right, look, it's a heroin addict. Are you going to interview a heroin addict? And no, we're interviewing the author who's written about it. But Dion, your friend, is a principal source for this story, and he is an addict. So it makes you wonder, is this hallucinations or tremors? Is his mind messed up? Or is this really true stuff?
Okay, let me address that. Yes, for much of his life. Well, quite frankly, he's probably been a methadone addict longer than he's been a heroin addict, but that's probably true of every heroin addict in the United States. They get addicted to methadone trying to get off the heroin. But as you know, as I'm sure you know, heroin is not a hallucinogen.
Right.
Not like LSD or mescaline or something like that. I've known Damian. I call him Dion Fuller in the book. His real name is Damian. He's told me he didn't mind if I said his real name.
Okay.
I changed all the names in the book except for those people who were public figures. And I've known Damian since I met him on my 16th birthday, so I know him very well. It all started in summer of 2003. I remember the day. It was July 12th. I remember that because that was also the day I was being initiated into the third degree of Freemasonry, and I called Damien to tell him that I was okay if they hadn't chopped my head off or something. And he wasn't there, and I left a message, and he didn't call back. He didn't call back that day or the next day or the next day. And 7 days went by without him calling, which was unusual. When he finally did call back, he told me that he'd just got out of jail and told me this strange story. He was because he was involved in the drug world there in Pacific Beach in San Diego. His house had become a kind of a 24/7 party house, and people were coming in and out all the time. And one of those people was this kid named Lee, or he said his name was Lee. Later on, the authorities told us his real name was Doyle, so I don't know what his real name was. It was either Lee or Doyle. He had gone AWOL from Camp Pendleton, but my friend Damien did not know this. And the kid asked if he could crash at his apartment, and Damien said fine. He didn't realize that not only had he gone AWOL from Camp Pendleton, but he had taken with him a DoD laptop computer, a 9mm pistol taken off the body of a dead Iraqi general, 23 pairs of high-tech night vision goggles, and a truck. I don't know how he was able to get all that stuff off of Camp Pendleton, but he did. I suspect it's probably easier than we might imagine. And one day, in the midst of this party, this kid, Lee, opens the laptop computer, and the DoD symbol appears on the screen. And immediately, Damien says, "Get that low jack stuff out of here and get out of here." And the kid says, "Don't worry about it. They can't track this." And then about 3 minutes later, there's an officious knock at the door. Damien opens it, and there is a woman who identifies herself as, in the book I call her Lita Johnson, but that's not her name. And behind her are two officious-looking gentlemen. She identifies herself as an officer of the NCIS, Naval Criminal Investigative Services. She says she wants to search the apartment. And Damien's dad was a narcotics cop. Damien's very familiar with the law. And he said, "No, you have to come back with a warrant." She said, "I'll be right back." So Damien closes the door. He turns to everyone at the party and says, "Take your stuff and go out the back." And everyone at the party immediately throws all their drugs on the floor, and they go out the back. And now, about 2 minutes later, Lita Johnson comes back with her warrant, and the NCIS search the place. There's drugs everywhere. They don't care about that. All they seem to care about are these night vision goggles. For some reason, that was the thing that most obsessed them. That's what they wanted. They arrest Damien. They arrest the kid who had gone AWOL. They take him to jail in downtown San Diego, and they give Damien the Abu Ghraib treatment for about a week. And they're constantly grilling him. They're accusing him of wanting to sell the stolen equipment to Al-Qaeda, and et cetera. And Damien, meanwhile, is trapped in this Kafkaesque nightmare and trying to explain to them, "No, I only knew him for a couple of days." And they didn't want to believe that. Why would you let someone stay at your apartment if you'd only known them for a couple of days? Well, because that's what he did.
Did you say in the book that the cops were also there along with NCIS?
Yes, the NCIS and the local police both showed up, and in fact, according to Damien, they were very like Keystone cops. They weren't working together. They were constantly bouncing off each other and kind of arguing with each other. So I don't know exactly how that came about, but both the police and the NCIS were there grilling Damien in jail, and they wanted him eventually to testify against this kid, Lee. And he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't cooperate. He wouldn't give them any information because he didn't want to. He didn't feel that he needed to, and he had nothing to do with this, right?
He has like a drug guy's code or something. He doesn't want to snitch on somebody.
Well, that was it, and there were also other people involved there that he didn't want to get into trouble, and so that was part of it, and the simple fact that he didn't do anything wrong, and he's not the most cooperative person in the world in the first place.
So NCIS is the one doing the grilling. He's in jail. He's behind bars, but he was not actually charged with anything, even though there were drugs all over the place, right?
Exactly. They didn't care about the drugs at all. And after about a week, they let him go. And he thought, obviously they've come to their senses. They realize this was all a big mistake, and they've let me go. He calls me. He tells me this whole story. And I think, well, that's very strange. He calls me back a couple of days later to say that things have gotten stranger. He claims that people are now following him all around Pacific Beach, all around San Diego. And by I mean following him, I mean 7-9 people following him into a 7-Eleven, like a parade of jarhead-looking guys following him into a 7-Eleven, following him back out, going into the Mexican restaurant down the street, sitting down, interrupting his daily routine in bizarre ways, making themselves, it wasn't like a spy hiding behind a newspaper. They wanted themselves to be seen by him. They wanted him to see them, and they wanted him to feel disturbed, discombobulated, paranoid. And he calls me, he's telling me all this. Now, at first I thought, okay, I could see if maybe 1 or 2 people were following him. It seemed improbable that a whole parade of people were following him. So at first, I have to admit, I wondered if he was suffering from some sort of drug-induced paranoia or something like that. But then he said that these vehicles were parked outside his house, and that these vehicles were following him all around. I told him, we'll take photographs of them, of the license plate numbers, and send them to me. And it just so happens I knew a guy who worked at the DMV in Seattle. So I collected all these license plate numbers and sent them to my friend at the DMV. And he actually ran all the plates. And what was fascinating was that none of them officially existed. Now, if Damien was being paranoid, they would have been traceable to a specific person who lived in San Diego and was driving this car. But no, none of them officially existed, which suggested to me that they were government vehicles. I can't think of any other reason why they wouldn't be in the system. And it was each one. It wasn't just like one of them. None of them officially existed. So at that point, I began to think maybe he's not being just paranoid.
Yeah, well, go back for a second, because, the significance of him coming up with all these license plates that are not real. I mean, what are the chances that you can come up with something? I mean, they're actually, you've got them listed in the book and the descriptions of the cars, that he could actually stumble on license plates that don't exist.
Right, and he photographed them, too.
Yeah.
Then, after that point, that's when things started to step up a bit, and they began, as he described it, bombarding him with hallucinations. I don't know how else to describe it. He would look out the window, and the scenery that would always be there was no longer there. Now it looked like some sort of alien world with 3 moons in the sky. I describe it as like a Boris Vallejo painting outside the window. He'd open the door, and it's the same scenery that had always been there. People would come over and ask him, is the room getting larger? It began to seem as if his apartment was turning into Doctor Who's TARDIS. You'd go in and the room would look larger than it should from the outside, or would look smaller. It wasn't just him seeing this, other people were also seeing it. And then he began to report that there were people in his house that he couldn't see that were interacting with him, that were moving things around, that were pushing him, physically interacting with him in that way, watching him while in the room with him, but he couldn't see them, except for specific occasions. And on one occasion, he was in the bathroom, and he turned the medicine cabinet mirror. He opened the medicine cabinet, and as the mirror was in motion, as he was opening it, he could see the person behind him, but only as it was in motion. And then the other time that he could see something was when occasionally he would see these kind of dots in the air, like almost like auras, like you would see if you suffered from an intense migraine headache. But it sort of imagine that in the outline of like a person, a small person, and things like this began to happen more and more. And he would call me in a panic, acting in ways that he's a pretty fearless person, and he's calling me, telling me about the fact that they had projected a shadow of a hand on the wall of his bedroom with a gun in it, and the hand would tilt down and point at him. One time he saw this kind of black amorphous energy sort of crawling around the carpet on the floor that filled up his leather jacket, and then the leather jacket began to move across the floor. Things like this began to grow more and more intense, and then the neighbors who had lived there for a long time began to move out one by one and were replaced by new neighbors who seemed decidedly unfriendly. The landlord started to act very strange towards him, as if the landlord just wanted him to leave. And then in the midst of all this, Lita Johnson, the NCIS woman, would show up at his door and say, "Have you changed your mind? Would you like to cooperate with us now?" And he would say no, and then she would say, "Oh, okay." And then she and the two guys who were with her would get back in the car, they'd drive away, and then it would start all over again. Like the second they drove away, all this crazy stuff would start happening again.
You're living somewhere else while this is going on. He's telling you this stuff over the phone as it's unfolding, right?
Right. I was living in Torrance, and he was in Pacific Beach. Now you might then say, well, you yourself didn't see this. How do you know this was happening? Maybe he imagined this NCIS woman. Well, he gave me her phone number, and because she had given it to him, and she said, if you ever change your mind and you want to cooperate and give us information that we want, this is my phone number. So at one point, I chose to call her, and I have the transcription of that phone call in the book, and she wasn't happy to be receiving a phone call from me. That was number one. She seemed very uncomfortable. When I asked her directly if she or people she was working for were following Damian around, she said she started using kind of CYA kind of language. No one that is working for my agency is currently following your friend. Very carefully worded sentences like that. And the phone call didn't go well. She basically implied that he was crazy and just wanted to end the conversation as quickly as possible.
So according to Damien, though, he's had some meetings with her in between the time you eventually called her, but in between then, he met with her a few times.
Oh, yes. There was one incident where they kept him up all night. I was on the phone with him and actually heard he was describing like invisible bullets coming through the wall and shattering
his window or something.
His window and things that were, the tchotchkes that were sitting on the shelf, and I actually heard these things exploding, and I heard Damien. He was extremely frightened, and as I say, he's not usually very frightened very easily. I mean, it was almost like poltergeist activity, that type of thing. Though clearly that's not what it was. And they kept him up all night, but he was scheduled to go meet this woman and her superior at a bagel shop on Garnet Avenue, and he comes up with the quote brilliant unquote plan that he would propose to them that maybe if he volunteered to work with them to try to get these things back, that maybe they would back off a bit. And when he suggested this, I said, well, I don't think that's going to work, because the way they're going to interpret that is that they're going to think that you had these things all along, these night vision goggles, and that now you want money for it.
All right, Robert, we're going to pick up the story on the other side here. We're talking with Robert Guffey about Chameleo, his book. Jethro Tull takes us into the break on Coast to Coast AM. The music video for this song is really interesting. Shows a time when humans exist only in museums. Robots rule the earth. It's Paul McCartney. The song is called Appreciate. Pretty good tune. We're talking with Robert Guffey about his amazing book, Chameleo, a strange but true story about invisible spies, heroin addiction, and homeland security. Still to come, the other adventures that both Robert and his friend Damian experienced, things that they saw, and the scientists they met who confirmed a lot of their worst suspicions. A lot more to come here on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back to Coast. Just to recap a little bit, the story starts in 2003. A guy named Lee, who was AWOL from Camp Pendleton, shows up at a drug house and crashes for a couple of days. Unbeknownst to this guy named Damian, who has the apartment, Lee was not only AWOL, but he had stolen a truck, Department of Defense computer, and at least 23 pairs of high-tech night vision goggles, and the NCIS comes looking for them, and then all hell breaks loose for this guy Damien, known in the book as Dion. But tell me this, Robert, had you ever studied group stalking? You'd ever looked at the idea of electronic harassment before your friends started telling you this story?
I had never heard of gangstalking, and in fact that term didn't even exist in 2003. It's only come into existence since then. At the time, the closest thing I could find to it was something called, they were calling it street theater, just as a way of trying to describe this kind of odd theatricality that was the element that was to the surveillance. I was familiar with electronic harassment, and I was very familiar with mind control programs because I was a friend of Walter Boart, who wrote Operation Mind Control, which was like the seminal book on mind control, published in 1978. And Walter and I, we collaborated on the screenplay together. I knew him very well. He passed away in 2007. So oddly enough, I was very prepared for the kind of electronic harassment stuff. I could wrap my mind around that. The whole gang stalking aspect was completely new to me. And I only learned about it as I was sort of digging around on the internet trying to figure out what this was. And I found a website that was run by a woman named Raven One, and her website has since completely disappeared. And I don't know what happened to her, but she had some very cogent descriptions of the entire technique that they would use to basically drive a particular person crazy. Essentially, is the main point of it.
And does that seem like what they were trying to do to your friend? I mean, because as you describe in the book, some of these encounters he had with these people, they're following him. They're not even trying to hide it. It becomes almost comical and ridiculous, the methods that they use. There's
definitely an absurd quality to it all. And the purpose of it is definitely to target a specific individual and drive them over the deep end by making them think that they're going crazy. And I think that they might even target people who are heroin addicts, who are drug addicts, who are on the margins of society, because most of the times those people, who's going to believe them? If you're a drug addict and you start going around saying, people are following me, they're shooting acoustic bullets through my window, who's going to believe that? And but they had no way of knowing that this guy had a friend who was a professor who knew Walter Boart, who wrote Operation Mind Control, and in fact, I had already been writing for Paranoia magazine. I'd written several articles for Paranoia magazine going back to 1996. So I was kind of, in a way, prepared for it. And even though I was already prepared for it, still, as I said, my initial reaction when he told me about being followed by a group of people was that maybe he was suffering from some sort of drug-induced paranoia. I mean,
was there one event other than that call to Lita Johnson, NCIS? Was there an event that sort of put it beyond the idea that it was just a delusion on his part?
Oh, well, I mentioned the license plates. That was one.
Yeah.
The talking to her, that definitely, because her whole attitude was just suspicious. And also, I should, it just occurred to me that I should mention the food fight with the feds.
Sure.
Because this actually leads into the conversation that he later has with Lita Johnson on Garnett Avenue. One day he was in the kitchen and he was making lunch, and there were these two guys who had been posted outside right outside the fence, outside his window, and they'd been there for a while, and they would come by, they'd make weird noises, they would say things about him, so he's in the middle of making lunch, and as they're doing this, he starts taking like flour, peanut butter, tapioca, Jell-O. He starts mixing all this stuff together into this weird goop, and then in the middle of it, runs outside and then tosses it over the fence, and it hits these two jarheads, and now they're covered in this like green slime, and they run away screaming into the Vons parking lot next door. Now, I mentioned that because when Lita Johnson wanted him to meet her and her superior at this bagel shop on Garnet Avenue, Damien went there with this proposal that maybe he could help them like retrieve the goggles in some way, and they didn't take kindly to that at all. They just wanted they bought him a bagel and an orange juice. That was, I guess, their way of bribing him, and they wanted him to just cooperate and to tell them where these goggles were. And the conversation didn't end well. Eventually, it just ended with Damien accusing them of being fascist, and the superior, Lita's superior, just his face grew red, and he banged his hairy fist into the table and said, "Enjoy the orange juice and the bagel." And then he and Lita Johnson like walked out. But in the middle of that conversation, Damien actually said to them, "Listen, I'm just tired of all this. I want it to all end. I'm tired of having food fights with the feds." And when he said that, Lita Johnson smiled and she said, "Oh yes, that made all of us laugh," which was the only one of two times when they actually broke script and admitted that all of this was happening, because in every other circumstance they would pretend like this wasn't happening, this is something you're imagining. It's like the film Gaslight. It's like they were gaslighting him, you know.
Yeah, so he's saying to her all along in these conversations, "Hey, make this go away. What can I do to make this stop?" And she's basically pretending, I don't know what you're talking about, but parsing the language like, my agency is not doing any surveillance of you, without saying someone else might be.
Exactly. And in fact, the conversation, there's something she said that I thought was very revealing during that conversation. She started talking to him about how she had grown up in San Diego and in Pacific Beach, and how this used to be a beautiful area, but now there are these drug addicts and these heathens running around, and we need to clean it up. And Damien kind of sometimes has a kind of Candide-like quality about him, where if you're insulting them, he's like not aware of it. So even though she was actually referring to him when she was talking about drug addicts and scumbags and we need to clear these people out, she's talking about him. You know, it goes right over his head, and this just frustrates them more and more. But I thought that was very revealing, that this was more than just they want these goggles back. I mean, they were operating out of a kind of weird righteousness.
So at some point obviously they wanted the goggles back, and we'll get into maybe other reasons why that might be true, not just regular night vision goggles, which are valuable enough, but at some point you think that maybe they just saw this as an opportunity to test this technology and let's go ahead and burn up the budget and drive this guy crazy.
I think what happened was when he refused to cooperate, he pissed somebody off. He pissed her off, and he went on, quote, the list. And with the whole gang-stalking phenomenon, for some people, it's seemingly random. They have no idea why it starts. No idea. It just starts one day, and of course they think they're going crazy. In Damien's case, we can kind of pinpoint, well, it's pretty clear how this started and who started it, you know. So after the conversation with them goes south on Garnet Avenue, everything kind of spirals down from there. The harassment gets worse. He starts experiencing great weight loss, hair loss, metallic taste in his mouth, which is I remember Walter Boart telling me that was a sign of basically induced electronic harassment, and it got so bad that at one point I volunteered. He had met this beachcomber on the beach who had a van that he was selling, and I actually, without telling Damien, wired him via Western Union $500 to buy this van from this beachcomber so that he could just leave town, because we figured, well, if he leaves town, it'll stop. And that
it's like you say in the book. I mean, it's like you say in the book. It's like, in haunted house stories, people will ask, well, why don't they just leave?
Right.
Or why doesn't he call the cops?
And he did call the cops, and the cops came, and there was one particular incident where two cops came, a younger cop and an older cop, and it was very strange because the younger cop was very sympathetic to him and wanted to know more, and the older cop just kept acting like he was crazy, and it was almost as if the older cop knew what was going on and the younger cop didn't. I assume local law enforcement, at least some of them, must be aware that these things are going on. When I arranged to buy this van for Damien so he could leave, so he basically threw all of his stuff into the back of the van and took off. Now there are those haunted house cases, by the way, where they do leave the house and they move somewhere and it follows them. That's this situation. He gets into the van and he leaves, and immediately he's being followed by these, what he described as weird little drones that are following him around everywhere. Sometimes they're up close, sometimes they're way up in the sky, lights that would then descend and get closer. In fact, I recently read your book, Hunt for the Skinwalker, about the ranch in Utah, and I found weird parallels between the two situations. And
I want to ask you about that. There's a couple of really specific incidents that I'm seeing in a new light, and we'll get to that in the next hour. But let's talk about his little road trip. It's not a little road trip; it's a massive road trip.
No,
it follows him.
It takes him all around the country. He goes through Texas. He goes through. He's driving through Kansas at one point, and you had asked me before, why else did you think that this wasn't just a hallucination? Well, some of the strange phenomena was being verified by people he was meeting along the way. And there was one day I got this very strange phone call out of the blue. I pick up the phone, and it's this guy with a thick Southern accent, like right out of Deliverance. And he says, "You Professor Guffey?" And I say, "Yeah." And he goes, "You know a guy named Damian?" And I go, "Yeah." And now I'm thinking, what's happening? Well, this guy proceeds to tell me that they just picked up Damian off the side of the road because his van broke down. And Damian had told them the entire story, what had happened up to this point, and they're freaked out, and they're calling me to confirm it, to see if any of this is true. As I'm talking to them and confirming it, and then some, they get extremely frightened, and they start telling me that they see this UFO thing coming down out of the sky and then descending towards their house. And as I'm talking to them on the phone, they're describing this, and they're extremely disturbed. And I convinced them after that to help Damien put gas in his van, and they did. And he drove all the way to Winona, Kansas. In Winona, Kansas, there's like 100 people living in Winona, Kansas. And apparently, if there's anyone getting gang stalked out there, move to Winona, Kansas, because apparently if there's only 100 people living in the town, they can't get away with this stuff, because you would suddenly notice, if there's only 100 people in the town, you would suddenly notice if a parade of strangers came into town following some guy in a black van. Also, people in Winona, Kansas own guns, so you don't want to be running around in your invisibility suits when there's a bunch of people with guns around. I don't think the invisibility suits prevent you from being shot.
Well, there's a note for anybody suffering from gang stalking, move to a tiny little town. I want to back up. Now, back when Damien was still in his apartment, we didn't use this term, but he started talking to you about invisible midgets, and I can only imagine the first time he uses that term, how crazy you must have thought him being. Invisible midgets, that sounds ridiculous.
In fact, the first sentence of the book is, my friend Dion first told me about the invisible midgets in the summer of 2003, which I think should get an award for best first line of the book in 2015. We used the term, he started using the term invisible midgets, and we started then using it over and over again, and it became a kind of comedic mantra. It was a kind of just darkly humorous thing to kind of break the tension of all of this. But there is sort of some truth to it, because what he perceived was the moments when he did see them, were that they were small, thin, agile people wearing these things, which kind of makes sense. If you want to give someone an invisibility suit and you want to send them into a covert situation, or you want to test out that suit and see how it works in real time, in an unpredictable situation, why not send in people who are small, thin, and agile? So they were little people wearing these things, according to Damien, and that makes sense to me. And so,
let me ask you this part. This guy Lee, or Doyle, who was the impetus for this whole thing, the guy who was AWOL, who stole the night vision goggles, who stole the truck and the computer, he was taken into custody at the same time as your friend Damien. What happened to him?
I desperately attempted to find that out. I've not been. I would love to know. If there's anyone listening who knows who that guy is, please contact me.
But as far as you know, they never got back their night vision goggles, or if they got them out of this guy, it still didn't get them off of Damien's trail.
Exactly. As far as I know, they never got them back, and yeah, I assume they didn't get them back.
You found a news article about a theft or something from Camp Pendleton around the same time. Oddly enough, an Iraqi gun.
Yes, that was another odd sort of confirmation. Someone had lost a gun, and this guy had been accused of stealing it. And he says in the article, I feel like my whole life has been turned upside down. The guy, I think, said that his whole kind of career was his military career was on the line, because they were accusing him of stealing this gun that had gone missing, and it was around the same time period that this guy went AWOL with the gun. So I don't know if they just pinned it on this other guy. I don't think they ever retrieved the gun, because as far as I know, Damien never described that the gun was there.
Well, what jumped out at me was in this newspaper article, this guy says he's falsely accused of stealing this thing. They assert that he told them that it was a family heirloom. It's been in his family 20 years. He says, I never made these kind of statements. It was like people were making stuff up on his behalf. That's why I thought it kind of fit your scenario.
Right. That's true as well. Yes.
And we should point out, Camp Pendleton, Southern California, there's a heck of a lot of really touchy, cutting-edge, military, spooky research that goes on in these places.
It was amazing. I was not really aware of how militarized San Diego is until all of this, because as I started looking into it, SAIC, which I think is a corporation that is at the heart of this, was only about within running distance of Damien's apartment, and other corporations like this were all around that area. And in fact, SAIC has since left that area, but they were there until, I think at least 2008. And in fact, I went there in 2008 to look at the SAIC headquarters that was there at the time, and I was amused to see that they were located right across the street from the Whaley House, which is notorious for being the most haunted house in California. Huh. And it just suddenly occurred to me that wouldn't it be interesting if maybe they built the headquarters there for some geographical purpose. Maybe there was something about that location that they built it there, but that's just a parenthetical speculation on my part.
We'll come back to SAIC and some of the projects and research that they do, because I should point out one of the things that caught my attention about it is they had the contract to run Area 51 for a while, and were very active here in Nevada in a variety of different kinds of pursuits, and the Nevada Test Site, and that's a big company. It's a gigantic company and a key defense contractor with all kinds of heavy-duty clearances. If anybody was doing research into this kind of thing, it would be SAIC. We're talking with Robert Guffey about his book, Chameleo, a strange but true story about invisible spies, etc. Coming up in the next hour, we're going to meet the scientist who confirmed many of his worst fears. Much more to come here on Coast to Coast. Pat Benatar announcing the launching of her own little surveillance program, I'm Gonna Follow You. That could be the theme song for NCIS in San Diego, at least as it applies to Damian, the key figure in this book, Chameleo, by Robert Guffey. Robert and Damian were followed, I guess, all the way across the country. This went on for months and months at a time, and I guess at some point you could say it sounds preposterous that anyone would put that much effort into it, or that there is such a thing as an invisibility cloak being used by spies to mess with people's minds. And that might be true until you reach the point where Robert and Damian meet and talk to the scientist who not only invented it, but patented this technology, and says that it was in the hands of the Army and Navy and other intel-type folks years ago. We're going to get to that in this hour on Coast to Coast AM. Robert Guffey, I wanted to make the point that while your friend Damian, or Dion as you call him in the book, is a heroin user, a methadone, and a variety of other drugs, I would imagine, over the years, you're not. You don't even drink, right?
Right. I've never even had coffee.
And you saw some of this stuff for yourself. I think we skipped over this part, but in between the time when this started happening and when Damien goes on the road, or while he's on the road, you experienced some really weird stuff with phone calls, trying to send him some money.
Oh, yes. When I was trying to send him the money to send him the $500 to get the van, to buy the van from the beachcomber. Remember, Damien did not ask me to do this. I chose to do it. And so it was going to be a complete surprise, and I wanted it to be a surprise because I didn't want anyone to know that it was going to happen so that they couldn't prevent it from happening.
You figured they're listening to your phone, right?
That was clear. Yeah, that had been made clear earlier. And so I called him, and I wanted to give him the password. When you send someone money via Western Union, you have to give them a password so they can pick it up. So I wanted to give it to him. I told him, there's $500 waiting for you, so you can get the van and leave today. Here's the password. And then he stopped me and he said, wait, I'll call you back and get it from you, which was a mistake because every time he tried to call me back, the phone would go out right when I would try to give him the password. I would start to give it to him, and then it would go out. He'd call back. I'd get out one syllable, boom, and then it would cut out again, over and over and over again. And then I realized it was something unique to if you place a collect call, there's a second there where the operator is asking the other person, will you accept the collect call? In that moment, you can actually hear the other person.
Right.
So as the operator was asking, Damien, will you accept the collect call, I yelled out the password really quickly, and then I heard him laugh, and then it cut out at that moment. So he got in fact, I didn't yell out the password. It was a clue. It was a clue that I can't even say on the air.
Right. Right.
That I knew he would know, and so he was able to get it, and that way someone else couldn't get there in front of him and use the password and pull out the money before he got there. So that was successful.
But I mean, there's no question somebody was messing with the phone line, so you could not communicate with him, and so he couldn't get out of town.
It seems like a bizarre coincidence if it was just a coincidence. Yeah, it seemed improbable that it would just be a coincidence that happened at that moment over and over and over again.
I should point out you had some other support for the story along the way, is that you ran into a woman who had a very similar experience, not only just in the general area, but specifically in the same area, same neighborhood.
Oh yeah, She told me that she was followed into the very same 7-Eleven there on Garnet Avenue, had the same location, the same time period. Yeah, that was very strange. And I should mention an incident that occurred while Damien was en route to Winona, Kansas, because it's actually kind of important. I mentioned earlier that there were only 2 times where these people actually broke the script and actually admitted that they were watching him. The first time was when Lita Johnson said, yes, that was funny with the food fight, amused us. That was the first time. The second time was kind of creepier because Damien stopped off in Minnesota, and he was in a bathroom in the middle of nowhere, and he's washing his hands at the sink, and a guy comes in and goes right up to him, and he looks at him in the mirror. He's at the sink right next to him, and he says, if you just give everything back, this will all end. And this is a random encounter in the bathroom, and Damien looks at him, and the guy looks like he looks like he's more tired than Damien is, and it sounds as if what he's saying is, could you please just give this stuff back so we can stop this, because this is. I think by this time they realized that Damien was kind of inexhaustible, like that he was not going to give in, he was not going to go insane, and I think maybe it even fascinated them. How much can this guy take? that kind of thing.
Well, I mean, maybe because of his years of drug abuse, he basically became indestructible or insensitive to pain, or he could just withstand all incredible amounts of whatever.
He could withstand incredible amounts of pain. I was with him, and we would see him drink so much alcohol that it would kill a stronger man. So so yes, I think that was part of it. And so anyway, while this guy is talking to him, another guy comes into the bathroom, grabs this other guy by the collar, and like drags him out, as if this other guy had broken protocol by talking to Damien. This spooked Damien. He ran out of the bathroom, got back in his van, and then drove. Eventually ended up in Winona, Kansas, where he stayed for several months. And it was there in Winona where he had some breathing room that he started going on the internet trying to find something that looked like the invisibility technology that he had seen in the apartment. And he found a guy named Tashi, who was a Japanese professor who had created this invisibility cloak, not unlike the story that broke a couple of days ago. And that didn't look like it. It didn't look anything like what he had seen. Then he stumbled across this website, Chameleo, projectchameleo.net, run by this fellow named Richard Schowengerdt. And he sent me a link to the site and said, you should look at this because this sounds really close to what I was experiencing. So I'm looking at it and by the way, synchronicity plays a huge role like through this whole epic storyline. As I'm looking at this website, I see there's this fellow. His name is Richard Schowengerdt. He's a scientist. He has top secret clearance. He works at Northrop Grumman in the El Segundo division. Project Chameleo is this private operation that he has going, not connected to Northrop Grumman. And I see that he is a 33rd degree Scottish Rite Mason. And I am a 32nd degree Scottish Rite Freemason, and that he belongs to the lodge in Long Beach, and I also belong to the lodge in Long Beach. So I suddenly realized that we're in the same Masonic lodge in Long Beach, and that I must have met him at some point in the past, or I must have interacted with him and didn't know it. So I sent the guy an email. And I said, Mr. Schowengerdt, I'm a member of the Scottish Rite in Long Beach, and I do interviews, and I mentioned other interviews I had done, and I said I'd like to interview you about this technology, this invisibility, chameleonic technology that you talk about here on your website. And he wrote back and he said, oh, sure, I'd love to meet you. So we arranged to meet, and Damian drove all the way to Long Beach in his van, and we arranged to have lunch. And I told Richard Schowengerdt that I was going to bring a friend of mine along. So I went to the lodge that morning. It was a Saturday morning. I went there. I met him. I realized I had met him before. I had seen him perform rituals at the Scottish Rite many times in the past. I instantly recognized him. And he leads me to his car in the parking lot, and we go have lunch, and I bring Damien along. We all three of us have lunch, and then we take him back to the Long Beach campus where I teach, and we both interviewed him for about 2.5 hours. And I entered into this not really knowing if this was going to lead anywhere. It could be that everything he was going to say would have no connection whatsoever to what Damien had experienced. Instead, as he's talking about 20 minutes into it, everything he's saying is linking up in bizarre ways to everything that has occurred. He mentions that he had encounters with the Navy, that the Navy had come out and spoken to him and were very interested in his technology. 12 years earlier, this encounter with the Navy had occurred 12 years before we're interviewing him in 2007 or 2006. And he even mentions at one point, sort of offhandedly, wonders aloud, before we've even told him any of this, he wonders aloud, he says, I've often wondered if they stole the technology from me, because he proceeds to tell us a story about a military symposium that he attended a year prior in 2005, where he was giving a presentation on this technology, and a woman stands up in the audience and says, "You can't be talking about that. That's top secret information." And from the podium, Richard says, "No, it's not top secret information. This is my own technology that I invented." And she says, No. The Invisibility Soldier project is completely top secret, and you're not allowed to be talking in this venue about it." And Richard said, "Well, after this presentation, we'll go out in the parking lot, and I'll prove to you that this is, in fact, is not top secret information." And so after he finished the presentation, she took him into a room. He got grilled for about 20 minutes. Finally, he showed them the paperwork to prove that, in fact, this was a project he was working on privately and that he was not working on it for any sort of secret government agency. And once he had convinced them of that, they grudgingly kind of let him go. So that was one of the first indications to him that this was already operational.
You also found, I'm sorry to divert you away, but you also found something called Defense Review, an article from March of '05. I remember being struck by this in the book, that it was pretty significant because the article from '05, and this is a really respected Pentagon-related publication, which says, hopefully the U.S. Army and the Marine Corps will soon have operational and effective electro-optical camouflage, a.k.a. adaptive camouflage, chameleonic camouflage, cloaking technology for infantry, soldiers, Marines, and combat systems. I mean, that's pretty blatant.
Oh, yeah. His proposals, he was taken very seriously, and certainly his partner, Dr. Lev Berger, is an eminent physicist, and he was taken seriously as well. They did many presentations at military symposiums about the uses of this. And while I'm talking to him, I started asking him questions like, could this technology be used to do things other than make people invisible? Could you use it to make an object look like something else? And he says, absolutely, you could. That's in my patent. I told them, when they met with me, that's one of the things you could do. You could make a tree look like something else. And he said you can make someone go crazy, potentially. And so as he's talking about this, he mentions that SAIC from San Diego had come to talk to him about 10 years earlier as well. And after he says all of this and then other things, the whole transcript of our conversation is in the book. At a certain point, I say, well, Damian has a story to tell you. And Damian proceeds to tell him the whole story, everything I've just told you. And at first he looked a little incredulous or maybe a little skeptical, but I remember the point where all that changed was when Damien mentioned seeing the people in the mirror when he moved the mirror, and then also seeing the auras that he said sometimes he could see them as these little dots in the air, and Richard leaned forward and he said that's exactly what it looks like when it's not working right. And at that point, I could tell that Richard was fully invested in hearing the rest of the story.
Can you give us in layman's terms what he told you about how it works? I mean, how does it work? How do you become invisible?
Well, it's much different from, for example, Tashi's invisibility cloak. Professor Tashi's invisibility cloak requires that you basically remain stationary for it to work. Obviously, that's not going to work in a battlefield situation. So essentially, it's a series of cells or lenses that reflects the background. Whatever the background is, it reflects it and projects it onto the person as they're in motion. So Tashi's visibility cloak, or the one that was recently made the news a couple of days ago, wouldn't work the same way as Richard's technology would work. Also, because you're, and by the way, that's why it was visible in the mirror, because they were cloaking the person, but they weren't cloaking the mirror. And that's why they could see it. And I think that's one of the reasons why they were using Damien as a kind of canary in the coal mine, as a kind of guinea pig, to see when the technology would break down. After all, you'd want to use it in a kind of unpredictable live situation before you sent people into Afghanistan, or some place where they could actually get shot or killed. Why not test it in a real life situation first? And I think that's exactly what they were doing, and that's what Richard thought they were doing. We spoke to Richard for, as I said, about 2.5 hours, and everything he said lined up with Damien's experiences. And then after that, Damien moved to an area called the Lost Coast up in the Pacific Northwest, and he moved in. His mother had a house sort of in the middle of nowhere in Humboldt County, and Damien moved into there. And the second he moved in, all these drones start flying over, classic, George Adamski type UFOs are flying over. So much so that the locals thought that it was the DEA coming in trying to raid their marijuana gardens, and they'd come out with their rifles and shoot at these drones as they were flying over. And none of this activity was going on before Damien moved in. And go on.
I want to return back to, well, you can continue that part of it, but I want to return back to this interview with the engineer, because there's a lot of stuff we missed. But you can continue the story about the UFO stuff in the marijuana area.
Well, I mean, basically that situation escalated to the point where some of the harassment was starting again. There was a period of time there where it had kind of died down, particularly when there was a period there where Damien was living in San Francisco, and he noticed that it would only start up if, for example, there was a Occupy Wall Street protest going on in San Francisco, or some mass kind of protest going on, which of course being San Francisco happens often. And he learned to stay indoors on those days, because if he'd go outside on those days, the harassment would start again, almost as if someone's pulling a lever and saying, okay, these are the people in the area that you need to be following on a day like this, during a situation like this. So the harassment sort of began again, and then he eventually left his mother's house and moved elsewhere, and now he's just the harassment has sort of abated a bit, and he's just laying low.
Well, there's a lot more to cover.
Yes.
I was curious about whether you ever felt that you were targeted. I know you had the conversation with the NCIS agent. You were there when the phones were messed up. You heard a variety of different kind of phenomena. I mean, you know that it's real, but did they ever come after you?
I wouldn't say that I've ever been gang stalked. However, I do feel like I've been approached on several occasions by mysterious people in unusual circumstances trying to pump information out of me. For example, there was one occasion where I was supposed to meet a friend of mine, and we were going to go out for lunch, and she was taking the bus to my apartment building where I was living at that time in Long Beach. While she's on the bus, this complete stranger introduces himself to her and offers to buy her and me lunch.
At a very expensive restaurant. I'll tell you what, I'm sorry, the music tells us we got to take a break here. We'll pick up that story with my guest Robert Guffey after this on Coast to Coast AM. A lament about loss and alienation. Green Day, Wake Me Up When September Ends, from the politically charged mega hit album American Idiot some years ago. We're talking with Robert Guffey about his book Chameleo. And still ahead, sort of the larger ramifications of this. If you have invisibility technology, the kinds of things that you can do with it to mess with people. For example, a lot of reports about abductions that are ascribed to aliens, alien abductions, but that involve military personnel, according to some of the witnesses. Is that where this leads? One of the other paths that we'll look at is Area 51, whether there's a Lazar connection to this, and Phil Corso, and perhaps Skinwalker Ranch, a lot of territory that I know a little bit about, and maybe you do as well. Some strange stuff still to come in our conversation with Robert Guffey here on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back. Let's resume the story you were telling, Robert, before the break. You talked to this girl on the phone. You set up a date. She's going to come over, take the bus, and come over and meet with you. You're going to go on a date. And then while she's on the bus, this stranger introduces himself to her, and suddenly it's 3 people on the date. Go ahead and continue.
He said he was a dock worker, at Long Beach, and he introduced himself to me. I shook his hand. His hands are like baby's hands, but supposedly he's a dock worker. He's got manicured fingernails. And he takes us to an expensive restaurant in Long Beach, and he starts saying the strangest things to me. And by the way, I should mention that Damian had been staying at my apartment only a couple of days before, and in fact, rather cryptically, he said to me, you know, you should be careful of strangers who suddenly introduce themselves into your life. And he gave this to me as a kind of warning before he left. And I thought that was kind of odd and cryptic. And then suddenly, here's the situation. And we're standing there waiting to go into this restaurant. He turns to me and he says, are you into conspiracies and conspiracy theories? I am. And I said, oh, no, not really. And he seemed completely confused by that response, as if I was supposed to say something else. And then he goes, I just read a book called Behold a Pale Horse by Milton William Cooper. Have you ever read that book? And I go, no, I've never read that book. And he keeps referring to him as Milton Cooper, even though anyone who has read Behold a Pale Horse and knows anything about conspiracies or UFOs always refers to him as Bill Cooper or William Cooper. He keeps calling him Milton Cooper because that's what it says on the spine of the book, Milton William Cooper. So this guy who's supposedly like really into conspiracies keeps calling Bill Cooper Milton Cooper, and he says, he goes, you should read this book. It's really fascinating. He goes, do you think that maybe, what do you think of George Bush? You think he's a good president? And I said, oh, yeah, I love George Bush. He's a fantastic president. And then he said, you know, I think we should have a revolution in this country. What do you think?
It was like he was trying to bait you into something, right?
Oh, yeah, it was ridiculous. And nothing I said seemed to jive with what he was told I was supposed to say. You know, so he was just kind of, the whole thing became a comedy of errors. And then there's been several other strange incidents. For example, there was one weekend. I had been out of touch with Damien for a couple of years there, and then we got back in touch with each other around about 2010, something like that. And my wife and daughter were supposed to go away. We were all supposed to go away on the weekend to Santa Barbara. At the last minute, I decided to stay behind to write. So I was in my office writing that whole day, and at around 2 in the morning, stopped and went into my bedroom, turned on the light. When I turned on the light kind of flooded the alley outside. The moment that happened, I heard all this scrambling going on in the alley below, and these people kind of running off down the alley. I should mention that earlier, the day before, I had sent an email to Damian telling him I had just found in my storage space a lot of his old manuscripts, his writings. So I sent him this email and I said, I found a lot of I found a lot of your stuff, but that's not the word I used. I found a lot of your stuff in my storage space. Do you want me to send it to you, or should I hold on to it? It's not going anywhere. Okay, now flash forward. There's these people scrambling down the alleyway. I didn't think anything of it, really. I was tired, and I just went to sleep. Next morning, I wake up, I go outside. The neighbor who lives downstairs says, did you see the garage? Now, I should point out that I had a storage space that was off-site in another city. That was the storage space I was referring to. But there were also storage spaces below in the garage. And it could be that they misread that email, because we went down the garage and the whole place was just completely torn apart, but nothing was taken. There was all this expensive electronic equipment the neighbor had stored down there. That wasn't taken. I had 2 bikes down there that could easily have been just rolled on out of there. Those were not taken. There was a motorcycle that was not taken. And the place was just completely ripped apart. So I don't know if the Barney Fife types who were like reading the email got into their head that the stuff I was referring to were these goggles.
Wow.
They thought that I had them. It could be a total coincidence that happened in that time frame. But there's several things like that.
We'll come back to the goggles, too, sometime before the program ends, because there's some speculation about what they might really be able to do, why there was this insistence that they get them back. I mean, obviously, they have value, but maybe this is beyond what we might assume. There were, these stories that are told by victims of gang stalking, these are sad stories. I mean, I'm sure that some of these people have mental issues, but it could be that some of them really are being targeted and are messed with, and it goes beyond just mental confusion. You said that in the book you outlined some of the things that happened to Damian. I mean, it was really painful. It seemed like he had constant headaches, that there were noises in his head, and it seemed to be some sort of a targeted kind of technology that your interview with this inventor, this engineer, I mean, he lent some support to the idea that this stuff is real, and you found other evidence for it too.
Oh yeah, we even asked Richard, could you make it seem as if a room was getting smaller or larger, that a room was larger on the inside than it appeared on the outside? He said, absolutely, you could do that, and that's exactly what was happening in Pacific Beach. And they are sad stories, and I've heard a lot of them now since the book was published, and also there was a shorter version of the story that was the cover feature of 40 and Times a couple of years ago in issue, I think, 305. So I heard from people after that article as well, and also since the book has been published. I should point out that it's not just drug addicts and people like that who are targeted. It seems to me that if you piss off one of these people and they have access to this technology, or they have access to this whole gang stalking community, your life's going to be a living hell after that. For example, Gloria Naylor, who's a well-respected literary author, she's famous for having written Women of Brewster Place and Mama Day and other novels like that. Everything that happened to Damian happened to her. And she wrote a book about it called 1996, which is presented as a novel, but she says that it's not a novel. This happened to her, and the reason it's called 1996 is because that's when her harassment started. She was living on an island off the coast of, I believe, Maine, if I remember correctly. She was living in a house next door to a guy whose brother was in the NSA. And Gloria Naylor accidentally poisoned the neighbor's cat. And at that point, all this harassment stuff that happened to Damian happened to her. And she wrote this book, 1996, which her regular publishers did not publish. A smaller press published it because they thought she'd gone nuts. And so it's not just drug addicts. It's not just people on the fringes. Gloria Naylor's a well-respected writer, and even she found it difficult to get her story out.
The idea that you can give somebody a headache, or that you can, there are weapons that transmit noise into somebody's head, you found evidence that that's real. I mean, there's really research going on into that.
Oh yeah, I mean that's been known for a while. In fact, Boart, Walter, I mentioned that I was friends with Walter Boart. He talks about it in Operation Mind Control, the ability to bypass the ear canal and implant sounds directly into your head, so it sounds like there are voices speaking to you inside your head. I should also point out that one of the things that motivated me to get Damien out of San Diego was an incident where he experienced in a kind of twilight sleep, an experience where he was on his couch in his living room in the apartment, and these people came in and held him down and injected something into his arm, and I know this was not some sort of nightmare, because it's the only time I've ever heard Damien referred to a needle with fear. And it was something he tried to struggle away from them, but they were injecting him with this thing, and it was something he distantly had this memory, as I say, as if it occurred in a twilight sleep. And that seemed really disturbing to me, and that was one of my main motivations for sending him the money to get him out of there. But in terms of the what you could do with this technology, the invisibility technology, I mentioned earlier that I was reading your book, Hunt for the Skinwalker, and there's an incident that occurs in there where you call him Tom Gorman,
Yes.
the man in the ranch and his
Right.
son, see this sort of pixelated
Predator.
predator figure, right? And later on, it comes out of the trees there, and later on they're watching Predator, and they said that's exactly what we saw. And of course, Predator is a science fiction movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger in which there's an alien that has this kind of camouflage technology. And that movie, Richard Schowengerdt, in fact, references that movie in our interview with him and says, yeah, that's sort of what it is. That's what it looks like. And in fact, the Predator movie came out around the time that he started developing the technology. And so when I read that in your book, and also there's a part where you're mentioning that there was a team, 5 teams of remote viewers who
Yes.
were asked to remote view the ranch, and they mentioned that they had seen that they all thought there was some sort of military connection to the ranch, and that one of them mentions that the overall impression of the group was that the location was the site of a military operation, an operation that most likely involved the U.S. Navy. And that was point 1 that dinged in my head. And then one viewer described the Pentagon. 2 perceived images of a Navy ship, perhaps an aircraft carrier, which was somehow linked to the activity in Utah. The viewers saw armed men in military uniforms who wore dark sunglasses and sported Navy tattoos. And then when I got to the dark sunglasses part, that also sparked, it made me think of the goggles.
Oh, yeah.
And also the orbs that were sort of surveilling them on the ranch, which I have a photograph in the front of Chameleo of one of these orbs of light that was following Damien around. He got some photographs of them, but of course, often it just looks like, a bright blob against a black background. And
right.
I picked the best one and put it in the front of the book. Also the way that the orbs would, there's one moment where you describe Gorman as suddenly making the decision to do something he wouldn't normally do, and he runs for the thing, and he is actually able to trick the thing and hide in a haystack while it's searching for him. And that reminded me of sometimes people contact me. They say, how should we deal with this? Well, of course, I have very little advice in that regard, but I do think that if you read Chameleo and see the way that Damien dealt with this situation, you can apply it to your own situation. And I think the thing to keep in mind is to do the unexpected. We all become addicted to patterns. Wake up at the same time every day, you go to the same spot every day for lunch, and et cetera, and they know that, and they're able to, by disrupting those patterns, they disrupt you. And so if you can disrupt that pattern and do things that are unexpected, which Damien often did, for example, with the food fight with the feds, it seemed like he was able to keep a step ahead of them. John Rappaport, who's an investigative reporter, he is a brilliant writer. He wrote AIDS Inc. And many other books. He wrote a positive review of the book, and he said something that I thought was rather pithy. He said, I think that Damien was able to survive the situation because he was already crazy to begin with.
Yeah.
And I don't mean clinically, crazy, but crazy in the sense that he's really just a genuine nonconformist and has never lived his life the way that other people live it. And so because he's already sort of outside the value grid of society, he was able to take that several steps further. And I think they were really sort of baffled and confused by him.
Well, so many of the phenomena, the incidents that you report in this book, as with the Hunt for the Skinwalker book, are preposterous, seemingly on purpose, purposely preposterous, perhaps so no one else would take it seriously. It's theater, it's performance of some sort. And as you mentioned, Damien, there are some hilarious stories where he's being followed by 5, 6, 7, 8 of these jarheads, as you describe them, and he'll turn around and confront them and yell at them, and they have to pretend that he's not even there. It's funny, but it's also instructive of how you might be able to deal with these guys.
I think it is instructive. It just occurred to me another parallel moment is you described the looking up into the night sky and seeing a blue sky, another sky in the sky.
Right.
And that's similar to when you looked out the window and saw the weird alien landscape. You mentioned in the book that you go through various proposals, various theories to explain what was happening on the ranch, and there's one chapter you devote to the possibility of this being a covert military experiment.
Right.
And then at the end, you kind of reject that, reasonably so, because you say, well, we know that the military wasn't experimenting with esoteric technology in 1865 because a paranormal phenomena has occurred on this location going back hundreds of years. But it occurred to me that maybe it's not an either-or proposition, that if you were going to experiment with esoteric technology, why not pick a spot that's already associated with supernatural phenomenon, where genuine supernatural phenomenon is already occurring. So your experiments are just going to sort of blur together.
Yeah, so anything that happens there is under the umbrella of, well, that's just the Skinwalker legend at work and not taken seriously. We did have the remote viewer team take a look at it, just sort of as a last resort, because we couldn't figure out what was going on there, the high strangeness, and they came back with these military images, an underground facility and people sitting in a control panel and the Navy stuff, and for the life of us, we couldn't figure out a naval connection because it's up there in northeastern Utah. But now I'm taking a new look at it, and Dr. Colin Kelleher, my co-author, had the same reaction. He's read your book, and he had the same reaction and wanted me to ask you about the Predator incident and everything. And I'll tell you, it's changed my perspective on a lot of stuff. I should also mention that it gets into the Bob Lazar story, and that came up in the interview that you had with the engineer who developed this technology.
Oh yeah, that makes me think of something I wanted to ask you. I had heard this from someone else, so I figured I'd ask you while I have you on the phone. They told me that there was an incident where supposedly a unmarked helicopter landed on the ranch, and these military guys came out and actually accosted the NIDS researchers or roughed them up and threatened them and told them they should get off the ranch and supposedly destroyed their equipment or something like that. Did that occur?
That's not a story that I'm familiar with. I mean, I've heard some of that kind of stuff as internet chatter, but I know the NIDS guys pretty well, and they've never shared with me a story like that. I would certainly hear that. That's kind of a story that floats around online that is of questionable source.
Right. Okay. Well, I wanted to take this opportunity to get it from the horse's mouth. Yeah, the Bob Lazar story. Richard mentions it because as we're talking to him, Richard suddenly thinks of the Bob Lazar story, and again, I didn't even know when we started talking to him that he would even be familiar with that type of thing.
Right. I'll tell you what, the music is telling us we've got to take a break. It is interesting how, over the course of that interview, he really opens up about a bunch of stuff, not only Bob Lazar, but also Colonel Philip Corso. We're going to get into that in a moment. We'll be opening up the phone lines for my guest, Robert Guffey, in a bit here on Coast to Coast AM. There's a song written by a guy who had a lot of mental and personal challenges. His name was Peter Green, and this might be his masterpiece. It's Oh Well, Fleetwood Mac from 1969, kind of how we all feel about technology and the rise of the surveillance state. Oh well. Well, we've saved some of the weirdest stuff for last in our interview with Robert Guffey about his new book, Chameleo. Some very strange paths still to come here in our final hour of Coast to Coast. Don't go away. Robert, I'm sure you've asked yourself why you are allowed to move forward with the book. They could certainly stop you if they, I'm using air quotes around it, wanted to. I suppose, I was only half joking about at the beginning of the program when I said if they're ever going to sabotage a broadcast, this would be it. But I suppose that maybe at this point they want it to leak out there in some regard. What do you think?
Well, it's interesting. Selling this book was the most difficult thing I've ever done. I mean, when the first thing I did was when we interviewed Richard, I condensed the interview down to publishable level. Like I got it down to like 5,000 words, and I sent it to several magazines I thought would be interested, Wired, things like that. And usually, no matter where you submit an article to, you will always get a response. It's either no thank you, a form letter, or maybe something larger than that, but you always get a response. For some reason, with that particular piece, I got no responses from nobody. It's as if they had never seen it. And it was eventually published in UFO magazine. And the reason I wanted it published in UFO magazine is because I thought that the people who read the magazine might read the interview with Richard and then begin rethinking some of their own experiences. And then when I say that, I want to be careful and note that even though you definitely could use Richard Schowengert's Project Chameleo technology to fake an alien abduction, that doesn't mean that I think that all alien abductions are explained in that way. I tend to think that they're mimicking a real phenomenon because, as you pointed out in your book, that doesn't explain events that happened in the 1800s that were documented by Charles Fort in his books, right?
Well, a name that comes up in your book is Melinda Leslie. It's somebody known to this program. I think she's been on the program. I know her. She's the most best-known advocate of the idea that there are human abductions. There are abductions involving the military that are staged to look like alien events. Talk about that a little bit.
It's interesting. I was at a restaurant in Costa Mesa with Melinda, and I started telling her this whole story, and I got up to the point of talking about Richard, and the point where I said that Richard had met with a corporation from San Diego, and that this corporation was interested in his technology. And before I could say it, Melinda goes, "Was it SAIC?" And I said, "Yes. How did you know that?" And she said, "That name comes up. That corporation comes up over and over and over again in these MILAB scenarios." MILAB meaning military abduction. People who are abductees, they're abducted by aliens, and then later re-abducted by humans, usually military-looking people, who interrogate them and are extremely interested in wanting to know how the technology runs. Were you able to? Did they allow you to steer the ship? How does the ship work? Describe it to us. And they're gearheads. They all want to know exactly how everything works, right? And often the MILAB, the people who experience the MILAB abductions report that the re-abductions by the humans are far more traumatic and terrible than the abductions by the aliens, which I don't know what that says, but it's disturbing. Yes, I spoke to. In fact, earlier this year, I interviewed Melinda for about 4 hours and a half because I'm working on a book that's tentatively entitled Imaginauts, Exploring the Outer Reaches of the Mind, in which I want to profile various people who I think are sort of on the cutting edge of the new paradigm, and I would certainly consider Melinda to be one of those people, though I don't think she considers herself to be one of those people. She sort of lives in the new paradigm 24/7, so I think it's normal to her, but not to other people. The entire MILAB phenomenon, I think, does tie into the scenario in Chameleo, and in fact ties back to a book that was published in the late 1970s, and that is Messengers of Deception by Jacques Vallée, who, by the way, the publicity manager at Aura Books contacted me and said, "I got this letter in the mail from someone who wants me to give him your home address. Can I give it out to him?" And I said, "Well, who is it?" He goes, "It's this guy. I don't know. It's a French guy, Jacques Vallée. I don't know." And I said, "Oh, Jacques Vallée? Yes, give him my address, please." And Jacques Vallée sent me a note, just a brief note, saying that he liked Chameleo and liked it even better than Cryptoschatology, which was my first book. And so I've been meaning to write him back and say thank you, but it occurred to me he might be listening. So thank you, Jacques Vallée, for the note. But in that book, Messengers of Deception, Jacques Vallée mentions meeting this man who he calls Major Murphy, but it's not his real name, who first introduces to him the idea that alien abductions could be something that could be faked. And he mentions several military operations where they took advantage of the local folklore. For example, in Vietnam, the Vietnamese had deep beliefs about vampires, and they actually staged these murders to look like as if vampires had attacked these Vietnamese, hung them upside down from trees with holes in their necks, things like that. This was an actual military operation. There was a scenario back in the 50s where the CIA was spying on Tibet, and they used an imaginary expedition to hunt for the abominable snowman in order to do that. So
you could say, thank goodness our military has these capabilities to use them and to protect us. And then you hear stories about people like Melinda Leslie who are terrorized, or your friend Damian, who they're spying on him in the bathroom in his most private moments. That's not what I want our government to be doing.
Oh, Damien said to me several times that he got the sense that there was a definite perverse aspect to all this. And it seems to me that the people who are doing this are either compromised people, criminals themselves, people who have been arrested. They're made a deal. We can either send you to jail or you do this for us. So the people who are doing this are already compromised people.
And there's no oversight to speak of. I mean, it's completely out of the purview of Congress or, inspector generals or something like that.
Absolutely. And also I wanted to mention before I forget that if there are people listening who are being gang-stalked, and I'm sure there are people listening who are being gang-stalked, I would like to recommend a website that's called fightgangstalking.com. There's a lot of websites out there about gang-stalking, and a lot of them are either useless or disinformation or crazy, but this particular one is extremely useful and rational, fightgangstalking.com. And there's a section called Tactics for Fighting Back, and it's just a long list of things that you can do that are very simple to fight back against this kind of harassment.
All right. We'll check it out. I want to go back to the interview with the engineer because there's so much that we have not covered. Yeah. You mentioned how Melinda Leslie pops up with the name SAIC. This engineer did the same thing, sort of, and when talking about who might have ripped off his technology, that's what he came up with.
Yeah, and of course he mentions it before Damien starts telling him the story. I mean, that was the first. That's where my eyebrows suddenly were raised when where Richard mentions the San Diego connection, and then it was just one link after another after that. And during the course of that interview, Richard, who's a very interesting person, by the way. I mean, I recently interviewed him again at his home. And I'm looking at the manuscript right now. I'm editing it as we speak. And in this new interview, I focus entirely on just Richard's interest in Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, esoteric mysticism, and its connection to science. And so he covers in there how the main inspiration for Project Chameleo actually came from the fact that he's a Rosicrucian, and that he had known people, or he had heard of people in the Rosicrucian order who claimed that they could make themselves invisible, that they had such control of their mind that they could make it like the shadow. They could make it seem like hypnotize people so that others could not see them. And that this idea fascinated him, and he began thinking, well, how could you do that with science, and not mysticism? But Richard had a top secret clearance all the way up until he retired, which was just last year at age 85. During the course of this interview, he suddenly brings up names like Bob Lazar and Philip Corso, and I wasn't really expecting that.
No, I was really surprised. I mean, I had no idea that's where the book was heading, and was very surprised when first Corso and then the Lazar name came up. Corso, I don't remember seeing this in the book, but you might recall that Colonel Corso had said that he handled, of course you note this, but he had handled wreckage, that his employer had wreckage from a crashed saucer, and that they dispersed it to labs that do work for the military, didn't really tell them where it came from, and let them sort of develop it. I don't know if you remember, but one of the things he says that came from the wreckage was night vision goggles.
Yes. Yes, in fact, I had forgotten that. Yeah, you're right.
So there's a certain symmetry there with your engineer saying that he was familiar with Corso and he thought the scenario was perfectly plausible, that maybe that's exactly how it would work, that even some of the researchers who think they came up with some of the ideas don't realize where the initial inspiration came from.
Oh, yeah, Richard had no problem with that idea at all. In fact, when I asked him, when he brought up the film The Predator, and then I say, well, do you think it's possible that some of these films are actually leaked information, a kind of time-released aspirin? He immediately leapt on that and said, oh, yeah, absolutely. He had no problem with that idea at all. And in fact, right after that interview with Richard was published in UFO magazine, I got an amusing phone call from a woman who is actually a rather well-known special effects expert in Hollywood, and she was working on the film G.I. Joe, The Rise of Cobra, which has invisibility technology in it. And she called me after having read this interview with Richard in UFO magazine, and she wanted to know if Richard had any of these invisibility suits on hand so that she could use them in the movie. And I had to explain to her, well, this is a theoretical concept. He doesn't have these hanging in the closet. He's not like Tony Stark, and he has invisibility suits hanging in the closet. And so I nonetheless, I put them in touch with each other. I said, well, he could act as, an advisor on the film. So she called him and said, would you be interested in advising us on how this should look in the film? And then Richard said, oh, sure, how much were you intending on paying me for this? And she said, oh, well, we weren't going to pay you anything, but you could have your credit at the end of the movie. You could see your name there.
Yeah. Right.
And so he declined.
Yeah, because G.I. Joe didn't have a budget. It was only, $25,000, I'm sure.
Regarding, as I mentioned in the book, films like G.I. Joe, which show, the great American hero using that invisibility technology in such an extraordinary way, it kind of becomes a recruitment video for the future generations who will no doubt be sent into dangerous situations wearing invisibility suits, either to fight terrorists or to fight your local drug addict in Pacific Beach.
On the mention of Lazar, his take on it seemed to be that Lazar was sort of a victim of a disinformation plot, that he was used. I don't remember you mentioning this, but it occurred to me as I was reading it, is that Lazar had always told me he worked for the U.S. Navy, that it was the U.S. Navy that ran the program out there at S4, which is pretty interesting if you think about it, that the Navy would have a presence at that facility.
That is fascinating. If I knew that, I had forgotten it, and that reframes things in an interesting way. There's another connection between the reason that Richard brings up Lazar is because as we're talking to him about Damien's experiences, he suddenly says, "This reminds me of the way that Bob Lazar was harassed," and I don't think that Bob Lazar has ever reported anything similar to gang stalking, but he was harassed and surveilled.
Well, there was a lot of stuff. There was a whole lot of stuff. They followed him. They tapped his phones. They broke into his house, would move things around.
Okay.
They would write things on his blackboard. They'd broke into his car and leave the glove box open and his gun laying there. All stuff to mess with his head. There are some similarities, yes. Okay,
there are similarities there. And also an interesting similarity that occurs to me is that whenever I've heard Bob Lazar interviewed or seen interviews with him, one thing that I noticed is that he always has a sort of dry sense of humor about the experiences. You know what I mean? And that's something that Damian also had, and I think that's one way. It seems mundane. It seems like a mundane observation, but I think it's actually extremely important is to maintain a sense of humor in the midst of all of this, because it's something that enables you to survive even the darkest situations. It's one of the reasons I wrote the book the way I wrote it. I didn't want to write a book that was like a guy standing on a bench in Venice Beach yelling through a megaphone about the coming apocalyptic fascist state that was coming to control everybody. I think that turns people off, and people don't want to be preached at. And so in my original proposal that I sent to John Oakes at Aura Books, I said I want to write this book in such a way that it's entertaining on one level, And I've been writing short stories, publishing short stories since I was 24. I teach literature classes and creative writing classes, so I really came at the book thinking of it as literature first and propaganda second, or literature first and journalism second, because I think that people tend to sort of block out anything that sounds like a sermon. And so the book has a definite sense of humor about it, but it also has a serious message underlying it.
Well, it is. It's a fun read, and the comparisons to Hunter Thompson are not entirely just out of the blue. I was thinking of Kinky Friedman, too, and some of the style and some of the storytelling. You mentioned also in the interview with the engineer, you ask him a question about, I don't remember if you ask it or he volunteers it, but the idea of, let's say you wanted to drive Fidel Castro or somebody like that crazy. Oh, yeah, you could do that.
Yes, well, not only does he say you could do that, he said I included the psychological warfare aspects in my original proposal. But I have to take a step back and mention the fact that when you meet Richard, he's like the nicest guy on the planet. I mean, I've never met a more affable human being, and he wouldn't be the first researcher or scientist who was naive enough to think that the military would use his invention for good. In other words, I think when he included that psychological warfare aspects in his proposals, I don't think he was thinking, well, they're going to use this on civilians, on United States civilians, in Pacific Beach, I think he really was thinking of it as something that would be of use to the United States as a country,
You mentioned that he was using FOIA to try to find out if they had in fact ripped him off, that he was trying to find out through Freedom of Information Act if there are documents that show that they are already using it, but he was getting nowhere with that, right?
He was in the midst of that when we interviewed him. So I mean that's an indication that he was already very suspicious about what was actually going on, that he already suspected that they had stolen it from him, because a lot of researchers, they come up with a brilliant idea, the first thing they do, they patent it. It turns out that's the worst thing you can do, because the military can take any patent that they want under its national security, and they can steal it, they can rip it off, they can use it, and you're not going to get sent one on that thing.
All right, the Beatles, Nowhere Man. Tell us, we're going into a break. When we come back, we open up the phone lines with your questions for Robert Guffey about his book, Chameleo, or anything along these lines. Much more to come here on Coast to Coast AM. It's the late Richie Havens with a message that hope springs eternal. Here Comes the Sun, his 1971 cover of George Harrison's timeless hit. We're talking with Robert Guffey about his new book, Chameleo. In a moment, we open the phone lines. We get to as many of your questions and comments as we can in our final segment of Coast to Coast AM. Robert, one quick question before we open up the phone lines. It's about the goggles, the missing goggles. It occurs to you that maybe they were more than just night vision goggles?
Now, this is entirely speculation
Sure.
on my part and on Damien's part, but we always suspected that perhaps the purpose of the goggles was to be able to see through the invisibility technology. That when you had the goggles on, you could actually see the people who were invisible. Maybe that's just us trying to link up to unrelated events, but it seems rational in the sense of, why did they desperately want these things? They could not have been just normal night vision goggles. Why were they so obsessed with them?
Yeah, it's the kind of thing where they probably throw away 100 pairs of those a day, just regular night vision goggles, or burn them in a pile somewhere. And they really wanted these back long enough to go after it for many, many months.
Right. There had years. Yeah.
Years.
There had to be something special about it. Yeah.
All right, let's take a couple of calls. First-time caller, Diane in California. Hi, Diane. You're on with Robert Guffey.
Yes, I was just listening to your program, and I had a couple of questions. I went through about 4.5 years of some really crazy stuff in Simi Valley, California. And I was just wondering if you guys had ever heard anything about them doing things to people's eye.
What are you talking about?
Like, I went to an eye doctor once there, and I had the puff of air test, and the one that I took there was extremely painful, And then I kept feeling like there was something in my eye afterwards, and I could see like a shadow in the mirror by my eye, and I kept seeing like the kind of patterns that lasers make with little dots, and they make triangles. I kept seeing that pattern reflecting off of me and on the shower wall and mirrors and stuff sometimes, and I had a lot of things happen to me out there. I was just curious if you guys had ever heard anything about something like that.
I have never heard of anything like that specifically from people who have contacted me. However, I will say that I wouldn't be surprised if people are being gang stalked in Simi Valley. I think that you wouldn't have to do too much to stand out in Simi Valley.
And Diane, when you say crazy stuff was happening to you, meaning what? Was it kind of the kinds of things?
About 4.5 years I was being gang stalked, and my phones were tapped, and I kept hearing things on my roof and outside my bedroom window. Every time I would come home, I would hear a certain signal. It was like a whistle. It would go, so I started paying attention and learning their signals, and like they used to use this long pole every time I would be in my bathroom. They forced me out of the house I was living in and into a house they wanted me to live in, which was like a block over from where I lived, and it went from like just following me to like total surveillance at that point in my home, and they were using lasers and freaking motion detectors, and I saw people literally disappear before my very eyes twice there.
Well, I'd be curious to know, do you have any idea why you think this started, or is it just random?
Okay, I found out since then that it probably wasn't just one thing, that it was a few things coming together to look like one thing and drive me nuts. But I at one point I think the feds were involved.
But why? Why?
Because I had some relatives that lived in another state that were mules and coming out here to California and buying crystal meth and taking it back there.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and my dad was like their uncle, and he came to visit me, and I think because of that, they thought I was involved because I lived in California,
Diane, thanks for sharing that with us. I want to ask you a question, Robert. Do you think that this is in the hands of regular law enforcement now, beyond intelligence agencies?
I think that there are certain members of law enforcement who are definitely aware of this. There's always been elements of law enforcement who are also members of intelligence agencies. I recommend Mike Rothmiller's book, The L.A. Secret Police, which documents all of that very well. And so I wouldn't doubt that at all. San Diego, Simi Valley, both highly conservative areas. And as I mentioned before, with Damien's conversation with the NCIS woman, she basically said to him that they were on a crusade to clean up the neighborhood. Right. So they had an agenda that was almost a personal agenda rather than some sort of national security agenda.
Diane, thanks for sharing with us. I was wondering, Robert, have you seen any videos? There's at least one video online that purports to show this invisibility technology. I can't tell if it's real or if it's a trick or some video production kind of a trick.
The only videos I've seen are the invisibility cloaks, like the one I mentioned before with Musashi, and so I don't think I've seen those. I would like to see them.
Yeah, I might send it to you then.
Yeah.
We'll have to exchange some emails after the show anyway.
Yeah, sure.
Let's try to go to west of the Rockies, Howard in Vancouver. Hi, Howard.
George and Robert. There is something in your story here that, in Robert's story, that stands out, that indicates to me that these people were really trying to play the spy game, so to speak. The woman that from NCIS that first contacted Damian, she identified herself as Lydia. Am I correct?
I'm sorry.
Well, it's a cover. Again. He was wondering about the name, but it's a cover name. It's
yeah. I changed your name.
I see. Well, what I was thinking is that Lydia, that's an unusual name to hear in this country. I do know, though, that the fiancée of Ian Fleming's name was Lydia St. Bartholomew. And she happened to be the assistant to the admiral that was in charge of the British naval intelligence during World War II.
Oh, that's an interesting thought, Howard, but nope, it was Lita was the name, and it was something that Robert just assigned to it. But thank you for the thought. East of the Rockies, Bill in Westchester, New York. Hi, Bill.
Yes, gentlemen, very interesting show. I would like to ask you a question about the cloaking technology in regard to the plane that disappeared in the Java Sea and the helicopters that were cloaked that were used to get supposedly kill Osama bin Laden, and relate that to the gentleman that did the missing 411, what is his name, Pallades, in our national forest, because after World War II, there was a program by the military to move certain labs, etc., into the national forests and to scare people off with a program, I believe it was called Operation Scarecrow. And the idea was to frighten the hell out of people, sorry if I use that word if it offends anybody, to keep them out of the national forest because they can cloak things, and that's what I was about to say when I called up when Pallades was on the air, but you guys cut me off before I could finish this particular thought, that why these people are disappearing is this is a military intelligence operation, and they're actually experimenting on the American population as they would be having a tendency to do if they could, and they are, and they may be scapping up people and murdering them in a program for some sort of military operation, biological or chemical, and I wonder if you could comment on that.
To address the first part of your question, in Richard Schowengerdt's original proposal to the military, he specifically mentioned that you could, in fact, use this to cloak an entire battleship if you wanted to, an entire installation. And so when you ask, could it be used on a helicopter, absolutely. If you could use it for a battleship, you could use it for a helicopter. As for the missing 411 scenario, could this type of technology tie into that in any way? If it does, it's interesting speculation. That's about all I could say about it. It's an interesting thought.
Yeah, I don't think we can put Robert on the spot for that. That's not his book. But thank you for the call, and it's an interesting idea. We're going to go to the wild card line. Jeff in Culver City. Jeff, good to hear from you.
Yeah, how you doing, George and Mr. Guffey? Yes, earlier you mentioned that the worst one could do is patent an idea, especially if it's in the interest of the government or military. What would you suggest a person do if he or she has an idea that may be in the interest of these entities, and how could that idea be protected? And also, do you believe that the government has the ability to subject anyone to, or anything, in the process of invisibility, and then project that invisible or cloaked holographic image anywhere on Earth without that person's knowledge? Is that possible?
Oh. Well, the first question, I would say the best way to protect it is to be public about it, because if you patent it, the law states that the military can take whatever they want and use it, and they don't have to ask your permission. So as Bob Lazar figured out, the best thing to do is to be public and in the spotlight. And then the second part of your question was, what was it? Was
whether he was asking whether you think the same technology could be used to project a holograph of somebody. I guess that's a little bit beyond your area.
Well, you could absolutely project that there is a specific person. If you want to make it seem as if there is a person standing in your front yard, you could make it to order. Sure.
Oh, well, and project it. I don't know. I wonder what the range is for something like that.
I assume that would be possible simply because I mean, Damien was looking out his window and seeing Boris Vallejo 3 moon planets. So if they could project that outside the window, I'm sure they could project a specific person.
Let's go to Matt in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hi, Matt. Good morning.
Morning, George. Thank you for taking my call.
Sure.
I want to throw out a little mention of something you were talking about, the invisibility cloak. There's an episode of Future Fantastic, which was done on the Sci-Fi Channel by Gillian Anderson, in which they did a piece on that. Showed a clip of Predator, talked to some scientist, inventor, whatever he was, and then showed a clip of them doing a test of a mirrored suit that this guy was wearing. So that's out there. That's to add to what you were talking about. That what I wanted to get into was this. Okay. In 1982, my brother and I were in high school, decided to grow marijuana. And unbeknownst to us was the year that Reagan declared his war on drugs. So corn got to be 12 feet tall that year, small patch, 30 by 30. I was living 50, 60 miles outside Washington, D.C., rural farmland type land area. And as the corn got brown, the stuff was still green in the middle, and we started noticing these airplanes buzzing all the time, more frequent and more frequent as the time passed. Anyway, as time progressed, within the next 12 to 18 months, I noticed being followed by what appeared to be private aircraft following me. I would leave my house, go to my friend's house, go to another house, and so on and so on. They'd be following me. And it's like I noticed that. It almost seemed like when they noticed I noticed them, they would back off. And I only have a feeling it was because I'm not the only one that was doing it. A lot of other people were doing it that year. And whoever I was rubbing elbows with was rubbing elbows with, and so on and so on. And I think they were, looking into that stuff, obviously. A lot of strange things going on in the sky at night. Lights that just kind of sit there, look like a star, kind of bobble a little bit. And people, nobody that were my friends believed any of this stuff. They look at, it's just a star. And I'm standing there one night with my friend. His back is to the thing, and I'm standing there watching it. Smoked the cigarette outside his parents because you can't smoke in the house. So I'm watching it. This thing's bobbling and pivoting just ever so slightly, but it bobbled a little more one time. And I said, "Look at that." And he looks up there and he goes, "It's just a star." And that was actually after an incident where a private airplane at night with the lights off came through that area, noticed its point of where it was trying to go was a bonfire across the way. Things that you find out as time passes. Somebody was renting a farm and doing
Hey, Matt, I'm sorry, man. We're getting a little bit far removed from the topic. I'm going to have to move on. I appreciate you calling in with your story, though. We're going to go to Tom in Taft, California on the wildcard line. Hi, Tom.
Hi, gentlemen. How you doing?
Howdy.
Well, I just want to say I've been involved in this program for about 14 years after falling out with a crime boss that I knew all my life. I can't mention any names, but I didn't know he was a crime boss until after my falling out with him, including my brother, too. And just to hit the nail on the head with a few things, you have General John Jumper, former Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Force, who said, I predict we'll have the tools to make people see, hear, and believe things that do not exist. This is the former Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Force. This guy didn't escape a mental institution. Lieutenant General Perutz said that I want to put sound in people's heads, and I'm going to hire electro-optical in Pasadena to do it. You have Lieutenant Colonel Timothy Thomas, who wrote the military paper, The Mind Has No Firewall, and the military paper Parameters, spring 1998, U.S. Army War College, who said that we can use this, we can compromise the microscopic hair cells in the inner ear of somebody. This is a Lieutenant Colonel Timothy Thomas, okay? These are high-ranking military officials. These aren't people that wear tinfoil hats. And this little bit of evidence I've given you thus far confirms that they have the ability to do the very thing that you've discussed tonight on the show.
Tom, and you said at the beginning that you've been involved in the program for 14 years. What program are you talking about?
I'm talking about the Gangstalking program.
What do you mean you've been involved?
Gaslighting, thing coming in, things moved around in your house, little things missing, vandalism to your floors. You come in, giant cuts in your floors, and they want you to call the police so you look like you're a tinfoil hat, so you look like you're crazy. The police aren't going to believe somebody's coming to my house making huge cuts on my floors. Of course, if you came home to your house and you know what your floors look like, and you see a huge cut in them, you're going to believe somebody did it. And, and naturally, or chisels cut out of my door frame, or I had a guy approach me and my 8-year-old son at the park February 24th here in Taft telling me, if you open your effing mouth, you're going to go to jail, in front of my 8-year-old son, And I called the police the next day, and I tried to get a police report, and she told me, the sheriff's deputy told me, oh, Tom, you should have called us right when he said this to you and all this, I've had a police car waiting at the bottom of my driveway, a highway patrolman. I took a picture of him on my cell phone. That picture's still on my cell phone.
Let me ask you, Tom, because we're almost out of time, but
yeah.
Let me ask you, do you have an idea why?
Yeah,
why you?
I have ringing in my ears. I suffer with tinnitus. I had to go on
why? Why you? Why?
I had a falling out with this individual I've known all my life, and he told me, Tom, don't be surprised by the time I'm done with you, they don't take you away in a straitjacket. And, he told me this, in Chicago. And, but the thing of it is, and I've had my life threatened more than once. I had a guy come and sit next to me at Starbucks in Ventura, California, one afternoon, and he told me he was an ex-police officer. He was well-dressed in a suit. He was like in his middle 60s probably, and he goes, can I sit down? Do you have a coffee? He goes, sure.
Tom, I'm sorry, man. I'm sorry you called at this time, but we're out of time. But I tell you, I encourage you to send an email to me, and I'll pass it along to Robert, and maybe he can share some information with you, but you should check out the website that he had mentioned earlier. Thanks also to our earlier callers. Let me ask you one final question. Well, it sounds like we're not going to have time. I was curious about whether being a Freemason has caused you any problems in terms of people taking your story credibly, but we'll save that for another time. Robert Guffey, thanks very much. Chameleo is the book, and it's a fascinating read.
Thank you.
I hope you'll keep us informed about your next project. This is an important book, and I hope people will check it out.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks also to my colleagues there at Coast to Coast, Nathan Staten and Ben Haley, our webmaster Lex Lonehood, Dan Galani, producer Chris Boros, and I'll be back next Saturday and Sunday night. Hope you can join us then. Good night, everyone.